Hey, what's up? It's Miss D, and now we're going to take a look at the civil rights movement for women. And before we jump in, I just want to kind of touch base because I think for a lot of you, you may not realize how much the world has changed, even from when I was a little girl. I am, again, you guys know, I was born in 1970. I am 50 years old. And yeah, granted, I get it, I'm old, but I'm not dead. I'm not ancient. You get what I'm saying? And yet I am really the first generation of women to come to adulthood in the this kind of post-feminist movement, this post civil rights movement. And so, I can see the differences from when I was a little girl to now. The images in the media, the images, what I had to deal with in the workplace when I worked in the corporate world before I switched into teaching. So it's really interesting. So I want to kind of give you, before we jump into how things have changed, I want to make sure you have a feel for what society was like before the feminist movement of the 1960s and the 70s. First, again, to review, the first wave of feminism we've already talked about, right? That was that suffragette movement, just getting women to get recognized as citizens of the country who were entitled to the rights to vote, just at a very basic level. But now we're moving on in this kind of second wave of feminism to talk about women as having equality, meaningful equality, social, political, economic equality. So let me draw your attention to the right side of this page, okay? Now, this is from a New York newspaper. So again, New York, liberal town, you know what I mean? We're not some little backwoods thing. This is New York. And in the 1950s, a newspaper published the question, if a woman needs it, should she be spanked? Okay? This was a question, first of all, that this is a question. Let's just break down the question. There's so many levels to this. Okay, let's start with the question. If a woman needs it, that question assumes that a woman would need a spanking. I'm sorry. A woman needs a spanking, that she deserves it, that somehow her actions have been so outrageous that it requires physical punishment. First of all, that's the assumption. And then the idea of, as a man, would you give her that spanking that she has earned? Remember, she's earned a spanking. Now, today, you would never ask this question. Let's just put that right out there. You put this is physical abuse. This is assault. You cannot, as an adult human, you cannot hit another person and, well, she deserved a spanking. No. This is assault. Just to be clear, this is illegal today. But back in the 1950s, this wasn't, not only was it not illegal, this is something you could discuss openly doing in a newspaper. This is something you could take pride in. This is something you could brag about in the newspaper. And let's see what these gentlemen have to say. Here's Mr. Miguel from Brooklyn saying, why not? If they don't know how to behave by the time they're adults, they should be treated like children and spanked. Think about that. That a woman, that he, Mr. Counterman from Brooklyn, you're going to decide the appropriate way a woman should act? And that you're going to treat a full-grown woman like a child? What? That's insane. Oh, look at Mr. Brooklyn Barber over here. He's another one. Yes, when they deserve it. As a barber, I've got a lot of faith in the hairbrush. When it is, there's no reason why you shouldn't go right ahead and do it. Don't knock the idea. Are you out of your mind? Let me just be clear. The day a man comes to spank me is the day I rip his arm off and beat him to death with it. We have, as a society, thankfully moved on. But again, this was normal in the 50s. This kind of behavior was normal and acceptable. You can see it also reflected in the media of the time. This was advertising. This is how you sold products. On the right, that women don't leave the kitchen. Why would we? Our complete fulfillment comes from sitting there doing housework in high heels, mind you. Doing housework in high heels, and with all the joy of life, our greatest joy in life, looking out the window at our husband and our child, because clearly that's all we're good for. Staying in the kitchen and taking care of our husband and child. Or, let's see on the left, there's another winner. Oh yeah, here she is on the floor. Woo! How exciting for me. He's stepping on my head. This is how you sold products. These are the images that are out there in the media. This is what you're telling little girls. You will grow up, and this is where that's where you're going to be. Under the heel of a man, staring out the window as your husband and child have a life, and you are trapped and imprisoned in the kitchen. So in the 1960s, shockingly, women are going to get a little sick of this. More and more women have been entering the workforce. We talked about this back in the 1920s, that women were starting to have this more modern view of themselves and their options. But again, it was very genderfied. There were only certain jobs that women had any chance of getting. Other jobs were completely shut off to them. Any kind of senior management role or anything like that, those doors are shut. And even the jobs that we could get, by definition, we were making a fraction of what a man was getting. So in 1963, a woman would earn 59 cents to a man's dollar for the same exact job. And again, companies were not ashamed of this. They would very openly say, well, I've got to give it to Johnny. Johnny needs more money. He's raising a family, and all of this nonsense. And of course, the fact that a woman, even if Johnny wasn't, well, one of these days he could get married. He's got to work his way up the ladder and all that. And in the workplace, there is absolutely no protection from sexual harassment. If your boss wants to pat you on the butt for a job well done, or give you a little kiss on the cheek to show you how special you are, he can do it, and there's nowhere you can go. And make inappropriate jokes and inappropriate comments about whatever it is. There is no protection in the law. And domestic violence, same thing. You are considered, as a wife, you are considered your husband's chattel. It's like you're his property. That a woman goes from her father's house to a husband's house. And as such, there are no legal protections. If your husband beats you black and blue, there's very little you can do. In the 1960s and 1950s, there's very little, unless he beats you to death or does like damage to you to cause you permanent injury, then there might be some legal remedies. But again, the legal remedies are not going to be equal to what would have happened to him if he had beaten a stranger. The penalties for beating your wife or beating your children or what are much, much less than beating a stranger. And even if you wanted to leave, let's say you're sick of getting, being a punching bag for your spouse, there's nowhere for you to go. There are no domestic violence shelters. And again, women are economically dependent on their husbands. So you can't make enough money. If you want to leave and you want to take your kids with you and you want to go, or you just want to take yourself, you don't have kids. If your spouse makes the majority of the money, you're not going to be able to make enough money to support yourself. And even if you could, people don't want to rent apartments to single girls, to single women. You can't even get credit in many parts of the country to even build up a credit score enough to be able to rent apartments or to buy your own home or what have you. And then in the 1960s, at the same time, women are much more politically active, right? We've been involved in the civil rights movement for African Americans. Women have had roles in the anti-war, anti-Vietnam War era. So politically, we've been part of these protests. And yet, even among the protesters, we are not given roles of leadership or any type of equality, even in these movements. The exception is the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party was exceptional in that there were women who had leadership roles, but they were very much the exception. That was not normally the case. Now, in 1960, women finally get an option for birth control. We get the pill. This is something that a woman could take herself and have control over whether or not she got pregnant. And just to give you an idea of how women are viewed in society, even though this pill was approved, even though it was legal, even though it was safe, women were not allowed to get it. Because the idea was, as a society, if you gave women access to a birth control pill, they might become sexually active. Yes, women might go out and have sex before they're married. Oh, shocking. As a society, how could we allow that? Now, meanwhile, men have been sleeping around before marriage like crazy. That was, well, boys will be boys. But the idea that women might do this, first of all, that's shocking. But then also, if you wanted to get a birth control pill, you're not allowed to do that. As a woman, you're not allowed to make those decisions. As an adult woman, you cannot make those decisions. Either the pill was made illegal by the states, or where it was legal, the only people could access it were married women. Because naturally, a woman couldn't make this decision on her own. She needed her husband's permission on whether or not she could put a pill into her body. Husband has to approve it. And again, this idea of who should have control over a woman's body is a big part of this feminist movement. All right, so things begin to change with the publication of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And we've seen this over and over in history, right? These very influential, important books and publications that come out that really change society. Everything from Uncle Tom's Cabin to The Jungle to How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis. Remember the muckrakers. And now this book in the 1960s. And Betty Friedan, for the first time, publishes this book where she really examines the role of women, this very gendered, very limited role that women are supposed to be content serving as simply a house, the caretaker for children and the helpmate to a spouse. And that limited, very narrow role is all you're entitled to. That's the only space you have in society. That's what you should be limited to. And that should bring you fulfillment. And if it doesn't bring you fulfillment, there's something wrong with you. That was the message from society. And as you can see, I think the picture really makes it clear of how women were viewed. Women didn't have their own identity. Women weren't seen as having their own needs or their own role to play or their own decisions. They were simply there to care for children, care for the spouse. They were important. She was secondary. She was the faceless, nameless, supporting character in her own life. So this begins this women's rights movement in the 1960s. And again, we see this coming out of World War II, where women had been in the workplace, had been earning a good living, working in the factories during World War II. Then we had seen the civil rights movement from the African Americans. And what ends up happening is the African American civil rights movement really creates a blueprint that other minority and underserved groups in America can follow to demand greater civil rights. And that's what happens with the women's movement. So the African American Civil Rights Movement had the NAACP and other organizations. The women have NOW, which is the National Organization of Women. So this is a group that is founded in 1966, which promotes equal rights for women. And a big part of that is, of course, childcare and education. We've talked about it before, that the schools of higher education are closed to women. They cannot go to college. There were some colleges who would allow women to take classes, but they would not let women earn a degree. You could come and take the classes, but you would not earn a degree. And of course, childcare is critical as well. If women want to have any, women need financial independence. We need some kind of economic power. And to be able to do that, if we're also, at the end of the day, the only gender that can give birth to children, right? So if you think about it, for a woman of childbearing ages, if she chooses to be a mother, right? The issue comes up, okay, well, if there's no childcare options, if there's no inexpensive childcare, like today we have preschool or nannies, we have daycare centers, we take those for granted. Those don't exist in the 1960s. They're not there. Those kinds of options aren't there. So if you think about it, if you have a husband and a wife, the way society was functioning, by definition, the woman is making less money than her husband, right? By definition. That just either because of the opportunities available to her, and even if they had the same job, he's going to be making more. The husband either makes more, has the potential to make more than the wife would. So if somebody has to put their career second to the children, if somebody has to sacrifice their career in order to raise children, by definition, it's going to be the woman. The woman is always going to have to sacrifice her career if somebody in the family has to raise children. And the only way you start seeing that go away is if there are childcare options. And childcare options give women a greater access to the workforce. So that's why it was a really important part of the women's rights movement. And again, banning gender discrimination in hiring. Big part of equality is, again, not just political equality, not just the right to vote, but economic equality, that women need true earning potential. One of the important figures of the women's rights movement is Gloria Steinem, and for a number of reasons. She was a journalist. She was a phenomenal spokesperson. She founded the Women's Political Caucus, so she wants to see more and more women in office. She founds Ms. Magazine, which is an incredibly important, critical piece of the women's rights movement to give voice to women's issues and to help organize women. But one of the interesting things about Gloria Steinem and why she really got a lot of attention as a spokesperson for the movement, and a big reason why is that she just didn't fit the stereotype. Now, don't get me wrong, Gloria Steinem is phenomenally intelligent, phenomenally talented. She could have horns growing out of her head. She still would have been an important spokesperson and an important part of the movement. But the fact that she also happened to be model beautiful also made her very appealing. Remember, we're in the 1960s. This is an era of television. So you need somebody not only to sound good, but when they look good, that's very appealing to a TV audience, right? And one of the stereotypes about feminism, and this is something that still happens today, is people will say, oh, of course you're a feminist. You're too ugly to get a man. You're a feminist because you can't get married. You would shut up if you had a man. That's the cudgel. That's the stick that they knock feminists with, right? That feminism, that your desire for equality comes from some inability to land a man. And this was you still hear this today, but in the 1960s, forget about it. And then you have Gloria Steinem, who is stunningly pretty. You know what I'm saying? And she comes out and it's like, you can't say that she's a feminist because she can't get a man. Because she'd have guys like crawling on their hands for her. I mean, it was obvious. She could have got married yesterday. She's not a feminist because she can't get married. A traditional woman's role in society was definitely open to her. She wanted to be independent because she wanted equality, because she wanted equality. She wasn't satisfied with the traditional role that women have in society. And they could never hit her with that cudgel. They could never make that argument to her. And so, again, I don't want to limit her because of her looks. Obviously, like I said, she's a beautiful woman, but she would have been a great spokesperson even without that. But the fact that she had that extra, it really did make her an appealing spokesperson for the movement. And again, like I said, really following the blueprint of the civil rights movement from, African Americans movement. As we saw, there were many marches, the March on Washington, the Selma March. Women also, same thing, had marches. This is from the 1970s Women's Strike for Equality March. This is on Fifth Avenue in New York. And again, like I said, I was born in 1970. So these are the changes that have happened in my lifetime, okay? That in the 1970s, when I was a young girl, if you got pregnant, instantly fired without any qualms about it. Very easy. There was no way to report sexual harassment because it didn't exist as a problem. Women couldn't get a credit card. And again, I need to be clear about this. The issue is not, oh my God, I need a credit card so I could go shopping and I want to buy pretty things. That's not why credit cards are important. It's not about I want to go shopping. Credit cards are important because you need a credit history to be able to buy a car. You need a credit history to be able to buy a home. A credit history, your credit report is critically important for you to be able to build and gain wealth in a society. And in the 1970s, women did not have access to that. They could not build any kind of credit history. So once you can't build a credit history, how are you going to start a business? How are you going to get a bank to loan you money to start a business, to buy a home, to have any kind of, if you can't get credit? So that's why that's important, this idea. A woman couldn't refuse to have sex with her husband. Again, the role of women. Women were viewed as that they were like their husband's property. And part of being a married woman is you have a duty to care for your husband. And if you are refusing to have sex with him, you're a bad wife and you're not fulfilling your duty. That's why married men could never be accused of marital rape. And it was on the books for a really long time. The idea that a man, by definition, a husband could never rape his wife. Now, don't get me wrong. The idea of two people are married, honey, I have a headache, whatever. Oh, baby, you want it. I get it. It could be very he said, she said. You get what I'm saying in reality. But think about this. What about the case where a spouse, there's a couple who are breaking up, where they're on the road to divorce? You get what I'm saying? Where he's left the home and they're in the middle of a divorce, but it hasn't been finalized. And, he comes over drunk one night, bangs on the door, gets into his house, and then has sex with his soon-to-be ex-wife. That would be, if he forces himself on her, we could acknowledge that as rape. You know what I mean? And she might have bruises. She might have handprints. There might be other evidence. Let's say a neighbor, she calls out and the neighbor hears her calling out. I'm talking about witnesses. I'm talking about dead to rights. The guy raped her. There's no way she could have gone to court, because since they were still legally married, there's no way she could convict him of rape, because it doesn't exist. It's impossible for a husband to rape his spouse. Okay. Again, women can't serve on juries in some states. So it's again, just like the women's suffrage, some states had it earlier than others. Same thing with women serving on juries. But in the 1970s, there were states that still women weren't allowed to serve on juries. The doors to Ivy League schools, again, closed to women, Harvard, Yale, all that. And the first Supreme Court justice that's a woman doesn't get named to the court until 1981. So not until I'm 11 years old. That's the first time you're going to have a female judge on the Supreme Court. So finally, things start to change with 1964 with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which bans discrimination on many things, but including on gender, on sex. So it also bans it on race and color. I mean, we talked about this already when we were in the last unit. But Title VII also applies to discrimination based on gender. So now the idea that you could have a job and only give it to men now becomes illegal. 1972 is finally where they ban discrimination in education. So finally, the doors for colleges and universities are open to women. Men they can't ban women from going to school. And today, more women go to college than men. Actually, we outnumber men when it comes to going to college. And part of, by the way, Title IX is equal access to sports scholarships and sporting opportunities. That's why I'm sure, some of you are going to see people who are going to either get a partial scholarship, or sometimes kids get full scholarships based on sports. And those used to be only available to men. And now they're a really important road for women as well. That also is available to them. And different legislation. So it is not until 1973 that women can serve on juries in all states. 1974, where women are finally entitled to credit. 1980, right? Crazy. I graduated high school in 1987. So just to give you an idea. So I was, So I was 10 years old when sexual harassment was finally recognized by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as a form of discrimination. That if you are in a workspace where you are sexually harassed, that is a form of discrimination. That does not create a safe workspace. It's finally in 1980 that they recognized that. And in 2015, so we're still not quite there yet with full equality, but we're still fighting, is 2015 is the first time women can serve in combat positions. So let me just take this real quick. First, you should know, look, I acknowledge, and I think everyone has to acknowledge, that the physicality of women versus men is very different. That men generally, as far as muscle mass and things like that, while there are exceptions, where there's some women who are exceptionally muscular and some men who are not, generally speaking, men tend to have much more musculature than women, just, for the vast, vast majority. Having said that, the technology of war and how wars are carried out are very different than they used to be in World War I and World War II, right? World War I and World War II, it's like, okay, I want to go to the battlefield. The battlefield is over there. You kill the guys in that uniform, and they are going to try to kill the people in this uniform. You know what I mean? That was the traditional old-fashioned war, right? But today's wars are very different. If you look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, very, very different. First of all, the technology of war has changed, which a lot of the technology in combat does not require great musculature to carry out first. And then also, you have to understand that there's no front lines anymore. A lot of women in Iraq and Afghanistan were like running supply missions. Like they weren't on the front lines. They weren't quote unquote soldiers, but they're running supply trucks back and forth. They're manning, they're on the base, and they're still getting killed. They're still getting kidnapped. They're still under fire, and they're still firing back. And that's because of the nature of warfare. There aren't any clear lines of distinction of where warfare takes place and where it doesn't. And one of the important things about women having access to these combat positions, because again, the Pentagon did study this, and they found that allowing women to serve in combat would not hurt effectiveness of the Army. Because if it did, that's a different story. But they found that it did not. And that, part of this was women really fought for this, because if you do join the armed forces, to be able to get ahead in the military and get more senior positions often requires you to have combat experience. So not having the opportunity to have combat experience meant that by definition, women could not rise in rank. It was very hard for women to rise in rank. And one of the side effects of this is that there have been many, many cases to make it into the news of really just outrageously terrible sexual harassment and rape allegations against members of the military. And not to say that it's only women. Men have also been victimized. But as far as women being raped and attacked, and the perpetrators, you find it either they covered for them, the military covered for them, or they gave them just a slap on the wrist, and it still didn't impede their career. So when you're going to put more women in senior positions in the military, part of the goal is to also kind of break down this very sexist, misogynistic culture of the military, and try to make it truly more equal. Because if you have more women in leadership positions, hopefully they can try to break down some of these, like I said, this kind of misogyny, this kind of male-dominated space, and try to make the military a safer place for women to serve. All right, now we're going to get into Roe v. Wade. Now, before I get into this case, Roe v. Wade is the case that the Supreme Court states that abortion is legal. And they base it on the idea of the right to privacy. Now, before I get into this, let me put this straight out there. There are a lot of people who believe that abortion is morally wrong. And let me tell you right now, have nothing but respect for that point of view. Nothing but respect. Can fully understand where that idea comes from. That there are a lot of people, whether it's based on their religious beliefs or just their personal ideas, they think that if they see a fetus as a a baby, like a baby that has just yet to be born. You know what I mean? But it's a baby. As far as they're concerned, a fetus and an infant are virtually indistinguishable. It's a life, and therefore to extinguish that life is wrong. Fine. For other women, the counter argument is that a fetus is not an infant. It is a bunch of cells, and you don't get a baby until birth, and that one of the issues is that one of the issues around abortion, and this is just to understand, is that when a child is born, generally speaking, traditionally, and especially in the 1970s when this case came out, if a child is born, especially if a child is born out of wedlock or even in wedlock, it has a very significant impact on the economic stability of a woman. You have to remember the number one people on welfare are single mothers. It is very expensive to raise a child, and generally speaking, culturally, it's been more common that men would leave the family and leave a woman to support children on her own. So there's a huge expense. And like I said, for a woman's career and things like that, that comes into the issue of having children. Women are often the victims of rape and incest. And the idea that a woman her body should be used to, grow this life that the woman herself does not want. The idea was, shouldn't women have control over what happens in their own body? And this comes out of this idea. And you have to understand that Roe v. Wade is not, even if you have issues with abortion, and again, like I said, legit, let's look at it from a different point of view. I'll give you two other cases. Before Roe v. Wade, there was Griswold versus Connecticut. And in Griswold versus Connecticut, that was the first time the Supreme Court said that women had a right to learn about birth control and had right to access the pill. Okay, so just giving women the right to access birth control. And that was based on the right of privacy. Because again, just in this same era, women did not have control over deciding whether or not they would take a pill that would control their own ability to become pregnant or not. That was out of the hands of women, that women couldn't control their own bodies. I'll give you another example. That women today, there are many, many women who say that they would like to choose to never become pregnant. They would like to be sterilized. They know they don't want to be moms. It's a decision they've thought about for their lives. And so as an adult woman, I'm not talking about 10 or 15 years old. I'm talking as an adult woman in their 20s or 30s. They've come to the decision they do not want to have children, and they don't want to take the chance of becoming pregnant, of accidentally becoming pregnant. And especially because birth control has so many side effects and hormones and things like that, they want to make the decision to go out and get sterilized, to get their tubes tied. And most women a lot of women who have been through that situation, who go to a doctor and say, I would like to have my tubes tied, the doctors inevitably say, I'm not going to do that. You can't make that decision. You're too young. Wait, you're going to regret that decision. You know what? Wait until you're married. You got to make that decision with your husband. This is very, very common. This idea that an adult woman does not know her own mind, that an adult woman should not have a say over what happens in her own body, that she needs to talk with a spouse, that she needs to talk with other people, that she is so mindless, childlike in her thinking, that she can't make these decisions, that someone else has to step in and second guess her. And that's that kind of history that plays into this Roe v. Wade decision. This idea that women do not get a vote on what happens inside their own body. I'll also put this out there, is that another part of this, again, not respecting a woman's right over her own body, is you have to understand that abortion will always happen. There will always be abortions. It's just whether you make them legal or illegal, there will always be abortions. I'm telling you right now, my own mother had an abortion when abortions were illegal. She had to take a plane. She had to fly somewhere. She had to wear a blindfold so that she didn't know where they were taking her. And why? Because my father at the time, they were not yet married. My father didn't want the shame of of a child before they were married. So he pressured her, what have you. They decided, whatever the decision was, that she needed to get an abortion. And so she had to go and had to have an illegal abortion done. And it was very scary. And what happens is sometimes these illegal abortions that happen very often can cause physical damage to the woman or sometimes even kill her. It is not uncommon for women to have died from illegal abortions. So that's the other piece of this, is that the feeling was for feminists is that that the value of this unborn group of cells fetus has more rights and has more protection than a full-grown adult living breathing woman. And that's where the frustration is. That's where the push comes for Roe v. Wade. And I get it. Listen, I've got 2 sons, and if the day came where they got a girl pregnant and they wanted to have the kid and she wanted to abort it, I'd think they'd get a vote too. I can understand how for men sometimes this could be a very scary decision. And like I said, I get the idea about people being uncomfortable with the idea that, the fetus, if you think of a fetus as a child, that, that you think of this as murder. So I don't want to get into the morality of it because, like I said, this is something that, you make your own decisions on, and I respect whatever decision you come to. But like I said, in the context of the women's movement, this push towards women having control of their own bodies. I'll give you another example, just how little respect people had for women's own bodies and what they could do with it. In the 80s, even into the 1970s, into the early 80s, if a woman was raped, one of the defense that could be used, if a man is accused of rape, you raped this woman, the defense was she was dressed. They could take the woman's clothing and use that as a defense for a rape. That because of the way a woman was dressed, she was asking to be raped. Again, not having respect for a woman's body, that she couldn't choose a certain outfit. And because she chose a certain outfit, that gives man the right to use a woman's body however he sees fit. That a woman doesn't have the right to choose how she wants to look. Or do you get what I'm saying? So it's within that context. That's why Roe v. Wade was so important in the women's rights movement. Right now, of course, the case is really under attack because, like I said, there are people who have moral issues with this case, and so in many states, even though technically right now abortion is constitutional, technically abortion is legal in many states in our country. It even though it's technically legal, it's functionally illegal in many states. Because what happens is there are many states that have passed so many rules and regulations around abortion that all the abortion clinics in the state have been forced to close. I think there's one state where there's literally one abortion clinic left. And the rules about how to get an abortion are so strict and so difficult that a lot of women just can't access it. So in many parts of the country, women cannot get access to abortion services, even though they have the constitutional right to it. We live in New York, so it's not an issue, but in other parts. But yeah, this is going to continue to be an issue. And right now, with a very conservative White House and a very conservative Supreme Court, it's not clear whether Roe v. Wade will continue to be constitutional. All right, so now we're going to move on to the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. And this is from 1982. This amendment would have guaranteed equal rights regardless of gender, regardless of sex. It would have ended any kind of legal distinctions on it. Now, this is one of the other points that I really want to make very clear. When ERA is defeated, right? So ERA is not ratified. It does not become a constitutional amendment. People always jump, oh, the men are keeping women down. Oh, men are terrible. This is a man versus woman issue, and the men stopped it. I need to be clear that some of the strongest opponents and people who hate feminism the most are often women. One of the most outspoken critics of the feminist movement was a woman, Phyllis Shadfly. She said that ERA was the work of radical feminists, and these women are destroying femininity and trying to destroy society and all that. I mean, you could see these ads, you know. If you had ERA, then there'd be no distinction based on gender. You'd have co-educational college dorms where boys and girls would live together. By the way, today most colleges have co-ed dorms, just so you know, and society continues to function. Oh, you'll have gym classes with boys and girls in the same gym class? Oh no. Yeah, we have that too. And we've been okay. But you get what I'm saying? Like, this is a lot of this idea was that military, police, and fire departments will have men and women in them and things like that. Restrooms will be, you'll have boys and girls peeing in right next to each other. Oh my God, whatever. Anyway, it's this, but like I said, there's a big movement of women who are very much anti-feminist. And even till today. And one of the things, I'm going to kind of throw this out there to you, because for a long time I had a hard time kind of wrapping my mind around it, because I'm sure it's become clear already to you. I'm very much a very proud feminist, right? I believe that men and women should be equal. I don't believe that anything's wrong with men, by the way. I love men. Mwah, you're fabulous. But I do believe in the equality of women. And for me, it was really hard for me to understand how a woman could not want to be equal. It just seemed weird. You know what I mean? Like, I just don't get it. Like, it was really hard for me to understand. And then I read an article. It was actually from NYU. I think it was the NYU School of Sociology or something like that. I can't remember which school it was. One of the graduate programs had issued this out. And I found other reports on this. But it was basically the idea of what they call benevolent sexism, if you ever want to look into it. And this, I'm going to throw this out there because this resonated with me and made a lot of sense to me and helps me understand, because I want to understand both sides of the debate. And so the idea of benevolent sexism is the idea that when you see gender differences, right? The idea of gender differences, to some women like gender differences, they see gender differences and the recognition of gender differences as a positive. They do not see these differences of differentiating men and women as a negative to women. They see a positive aspect of it. So let me throw this out there. For example, if you tell me, well, you're a woman, you have to go and take care of the children, stay home, don't get a job, you should be taking care of children, this would make my skin crawl, right? Hey, what are you talking about? I'm equal. I want to get a job and I want to make my own living and I want to make my own career. But for other women, they see that same thing and they go, oh, how wonderful that I have the option to stay home with my children. I have the option to be a homemaker, where men go out and make a living and they have to have all the stress and all the hassle of having to support a family. Whereas as a woman, how wonderful that I have a man that's taking care of me. He's not limiting me. He's caring for me. He's not limiting me. He's protecting me. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, all these things, like, for me, I'm like, hey, listen, I don't need you to pull out my chair. Let me give me a career where I can make as much money or more money than a man. And you don't need to pay for the first date. I'll pay for my own dinner on a first date. You know what I'm saying? Like, but for other women, they really see the benefits of this, and they see it in that sense. Like I said, benevolent sexism. So a lot of women see gender differences as benefiting women and as a positive aspect for womanhood. So like I said, I've read that article some other places, but to my mind, it helped me kind of put this in a different frame and kind of look at it a different way. And then it makes more sense why some women would disagree with it. Now, I don't necessarily agree with their viewpoint, but at least it doesn't make me feel like they're completely nuts. So anyway, so there you go. All right, moving forward. So we've talked about that kind of first wave of feminism, which was the suffragette movement and the right to vote. And then the second wave of feminism that was really about that 1960s into the 70s movement for political, social, and economic equality. we do have, people have identified today a third and fourth wave of feminism. The third wave of feminism coming out of the 1990s, this is the one that I really identify with. This is what, when I was in college and into law school and into grad school, this is what I was saying, is this idea of redefining what it means to be a woman, what it means to be feminine, what it means to be masculine. That these gendered ideas of what men and women should be is something that we really need to attack, and that it's negative for both sexes, that it's very, very limiting. So, for example, if you take a look at the top right, training to be Batman, men are going to be big and strong and tough. And a woman, she's training to be Batman's wife. And, like a little boy grows up to be a hero. And a girl grows up to need a hero to take care of her. Like, this is that was kind of fighting those kinds of stereotypes, these kind of very gendered ideas of what people should grow into. That's why, like, if you look at even the cartoons of today, right? If you compare the storyline of, let's say, a Snow White or Sleeping Beauty, right? The early Disney movies. And now you look at the newer Disney movies, right? You look at even Frozen, or you look at Tangled, or you look at, these more modern Disney princesses. They are much more stronger, much more positive role models of what women should be, right? And so they've kind of adapted to this new, much more expanded idea of what womanhood is and what femininity should be. And again, this idea of guys should be child, caretakers for their kids. You know what I mean? Like, there should be changing tables in the men's room. Guys, you should be able to, like, help raise your kids. You don't have to sit back while the wife does everything. You should have a relationship with your children too. Being a father is an important role, and you should be part of that as well. And kind of rejecting that kind of us versus them, man versus woman dynamic. And that was a big part of it. The other big thing that's really today, the focus of feminism is on this idea of intersectionality. And what's that? That's an acknowledgement that this feminist movement of the 70s really was a movement of cisgendered white females. So this is white women, born as a woman. This was their movement, and it was focused on their issues. And today there is an acknowledgement that the feminist movement needs to expand past that the issues facing white women is very different than the issues facing black women. That the issues facing cisgendered women is very different than trans women. Trans women are being killed at a rate that is obscene. They're murdered very, very frequently. And this kind of, that we have to look at transgender issue. We have to look at the wage gap as it affects black women versus white women. So very, very different. And that kind of acknowledgement of how these racism, sexism, gay rights, how these kinds of overlap. So that's the focus of the women's movement of today. And again, the other big issue is, of course, Roe v. Wade, and to fight the limitations on access to abortion and for family planning. And unfortunately, the work is not done. We still see these sexist images in the media. This is a recent Gap ad. This isn't from the 1970s. It's recent, where the girl is the social butterfly and the boy is a little scholar. He's going to be smart, and she'll grow up to be pretty and have lots of friends. That's terrible. I want more for myself. I want more for the girls out there, and I want more for the guys too. And look at the image on the bottom right. I mean, that's in advertising. That's supposed to be sexy. This kind of sicko rape fantasy of a woman getting her throat stepped on. This is supposed to be hot. This is how you sell things. I mean, that's ridiculous. So we still have these very sexist, this violent, misogynistic imagery. Misogyny is like very male-dominated. Men are better than women kind of image. So this misogynistic imagery, it's still out there. We're still fighting. It's not over. And again, 2017 today, we still have an annual Women's Rights March. 2017, it started because when Trump took office, and again, obviously, he's very conservative, and there was concern, and there still is, about further limitations on Roe v. Wade. And in 2006, we had the Me Too movement, acknowledging that sexism in the workplace still exists to a degree that's wrong, that women are still being victimized, and this is one of the things that's keeping women from having true economic equality. And to the woman's point on the left, yeah, we're still fighting. We're still fighting. And let me end you with this idea that feminism should not be a woman's issue. It really shouldn't. That as men, you may not realize it, but a lot of this equality of the sexes has benefits. This is not going to hurt you. The rights is not a pie. If I get more rights, it's not like a pie, like I get a piece, that means there's less for you. It's not a pizza. Okay? Just because I get more rights, it doesn't mean that I'm taking them from you. So, for example, if you have, back before the feminist movement, if a husband and a wife got divorced, the kid went with the wife. Period. End of discussion. The kid went with the wife. That was, the kid spent more time with the woman, so therefore the kid went with the kid, and then the kid went with the wife, and fathers very often never got to see their kids again. Very common in divorce cases. Today, that standard is getting broken down. That, for example, in New York, custody is based on the best interest of the child. It is now a gender neutral standard. Do we have to move forward with it and push harder? Yes. But thank God, I have sons, and if they got divorced, I want them to have equal access to their kids. The same way, too, if my sons have a child, I don't want them to be at work, getting a phone call, oh, your wife gave birth? Oh, okay, honey, good job giving birth. Okay, I got to go back to work. Click. And then he's got to go back the next day? My son should have paternity leave. The same way a woman is entitled to maternity leave to spend time with her newborn child, and the feminist movement has been fighting for that. As women win maternity leave, that is leading to men getting paternity leave. That, yes, you should get time off work to spend with your newborn child or with your newly adopted child. There have been many times, because of feminism, unequal treatment under the law is not allowed anymore. So, for example, the drinking age. Women used to be able to drink at a younger age than men. Family and Medical Leave Act. Can you imagine for a second? If you have a family member, right? Your parent gets sick, right? And it's you and your sister, and your sister's a screw up, but you are, the responsible kid. Do you know your sister could get time off of work to take care of your sick parent, but you couldn't? That you were not entitled because you have a penis? You're not entitled to take time off of work to care for a sick relative? That, again, these kind of gender differences. And now it is gender neutral. You should be able to take off time from work to care for a sick relative. Again, illegal abortion and birth control, it's a benefit to men as well. If you don't want to be a parent before you're ready, having access to those things is also, it can be a benefit to you as well. That rape used to be defined as only a woman's issue. And there is now, with the feminist movement, there's acknowledgement that it happens to men too, and men deserve legal protection, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of issues. Men are becoming more stay-at-home dads, and, men benefit from having better career options for their children, for their wives. It does create a more equal society, does bring benefits to both genders. All right, with that, I'm going to end this presentation. And, next time we will talk about civil rights for other groups of Americans.